The first time I saw Mr. Bennett in my courtroom, I did not recognize him by his face. I recognized him by the way he stood when he was afraid. Even after 20 years, that part had not changed. His shoulders were still too stiff. His chin still lifted half an inch higher than it should have. Like pride was a habit his body kept reaching for, even after the rest of him had lost the strength to support it. The courtroom was colder than usual that morning. The kind of sharp government building cold that settles into the wood and never fully leaves. And the air smelled faintly of paper, old polish, and stale coffee from the clerk's station near the back wall. Sunlight came through the high windows in pale gray strips, turning dust into something visible. I was reviewing the docket with my reading glasses low on my nose when the bailiff called the next case, and a man in a wrinkled charcoal suit stepped forward from the defense table. I looked up, and for one strange second, time did not move backward. It folded, because I was not 42 anymore. Seated above him in black robes with the seal of the county behind me, I was 14 again, standing in a fluorescent classroom with my backpack hanging from one shoulder, heat crawling up my neck, while a history teacher with a wedding ring and a pressed tie and a voice full of easy contempt looked me in the face and told me I would probably end up in prison like my father. That sentence built a room inside me. It took years to tear it down. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, let me take you back to where it all started. And if this story resonates with you, like and subscribe, only if it does. Because some people know what it feels like to walk into a room already carrying someone else's reputation. To be treated like a warning before you have even become a person. To have adults speak over your future as if they are describing the weather instead of shaping it. My name is Elena Ruse. Most people call me Elena now. When I was a child, almost everybody called me Ellie. Except my father. My father called me Judge. The first time he said it, I was 8 years old and sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with a library book open in my lap and a pencil tucked behind one ear because I liked to underline words. I had to look up later. Our apartment was on the south side of Milwaukee, above a laundromat that steamed the windows in winter and made the hallway smell like detergent and hot metal. The walls were thin. The carpet held the memory of every tenant before us. When buses passed the building at night, the dishes in our cabinet clicked softly together like teeth. My father came home late that evening with cold air in his coat and kissed the top of my head on his way to the sink. "What are you doing?" "Judge?" he asked. "Reading." "What are you underlining?" "Words I don't know." He smiled. "Well," he said, "that's how you get powerful." He worked nights then, mostly loading freight at a distribution warehouse outside the city. He was broad-shouldered, quiet, and tired in the way men get when life has not been kind to them, but they are still trying to be gentle inside the house. My earliest memory of him is not his face. It is the smell of winter on his jacket and the roughness of his hands lifting me from the couch when I pretended to be asleep so he would carry me to bed. My mother left when I was 10. Not dramatically. No shouting, no dishes, no slammed door at midnight. She just stopped enduring her own life and moved to Phoenix with a man she met through work who sold commercial lighting systems and used phrases like "next chapter" as if pain could be rebranded into optimism. She cried when she told me. My father didn't. That was worse. After she left, the apartment grew quieter, but somehow harder to breathe in. The kitchen always smelled like instant coffee and overcooked rice. Bills started appearing in neat stacks under a magnet shaped like a sunflower. My father stopped buying lunch and started skipping dinner more often than he admitted. He still packed mine. peanut butter sandwiches, apples. When they were cheap, crackers in plastic bags tied too tightly. He never spoke badly about my mother. That was one of his best qualities. It may also have been one of his failures. Because children will build myths in silence if no adult puts words around what is happening. I built mine quickly. She left because life with us was heavy. Money was heavy. My father was heavy. I was part of the weight. By the time I turned 12, I had become the kind of child who moved carefully in her own home. I rinsed every dish the second I used it. I folded my school clothes before bed so mornings would be smoother. I learned which grocery store marked down bread after 7. I learned which notices were utility bills and which ones were final warnings. I learned how to listen for adult fear even when it was hidden under ordinary sentences. Then my father got hurt. A crate slipped during a night shift and crushed 2 fingers on his left hand. The break was ugly. The nerve damage lasted. He missed work. Then lost work. Then found smaller work that paid less and demanded more. Pain changed him before desperation did. He slept badly. He snapped more easily. The apartment shrank under the pressure of it. Still, he tried. That part matters. He tried to protect my school life from the worst of it. He still ironed my uniform shirts on Sundays. Still asked about my tests. Still told me to read harder than my circumstances. Still kissed my forehead before dawn. When he left for temporary labor jobs, he picked up wherever he could. Then one November night, he didn't come home. I waited longer than usual. First at the window. Then on the couch. Then, with the little kitchen clock ticking too loudly above the stove. By 1 a.m, I called his cell phone twice and got voicemail both times. At 5:30, someone knocked on our door. 2 officers. 1 woman. 1 man. The woman spoke gently. That's how I remember it. Even now. Too gently. As if her voice had already decided I was going to break. There had been an altercation outside a liquor store. A man robbed at knife point. My father had been there. Then he had not only been there, he had participated. I remember holding the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my fingertips went numb. No, I said. Not because I believed police never told the truth. Because I believed my father still belonged to the version of himself that tucked library books under my arm and called me judge. The legal process moved faster than grief and slower than rent. A public defender. A plea. 3 years. Armed robbery reduced under a deal because no one was seriously injured and because it was his first major offense. I did not understand all the language then. Only the result. My father put on an orange jumpsuit. And the world took our last good name and flattened it into something people could whisper. I visited him twice before I stopped. That sentence can sound cruel unless you know what visiting a correctional facility feels like at 13. The bleach smell, the hard plastic chairs, the vending machines full of stale candy, the fluorescent light that makes everyone look already forgiven by no one. My father tried to smile through it, tried to ask about school, tried to stay my father inside a room built to turn people into cautionary tales. On the second visit, he pressed his palm against the scratched plastic divider and said, "You are not me. Ellie, do you hear me? You are not my worst choice." I nodded. Then cried in the restroom afterward with my fist in my mouth so no one would hear. The next Monday, everybody at school knew. There are many ways children can become cruel. The easiest is when an adult has already laid the groundwork. My middle school was brick. Drafty. And old enough that the pipes clanged in winter. The hallways smelled like pencil shavings, cafeteria grease, and wet coats. I had spent most of 7th grade trying to disappear into competence. Good grades, quiet behavior, clean work. The kind of invisibility schools reward only if no one gives them a reason not to. After my father's arrest, invisibility ended. At first it was whispers, then side glances, then boys in the back row asking whether I'd learned how to pick locks at home. Girls who used to borrow my highlighters stopped sitting near me at lunch. One afternoon, I opened my locker and found a note folded inside a page torn from notebook paper. Like father, like daughter. I threw it away before anyone saw me read it. The adult who did the most damage was not a student. It was Mr. Fowen, Bennett. 8th grade civics and American history. He was the kind of teacher parents praised because he looked organized from a distance. Crisp shirts, clean board handwriting, rules framed as life lessons. He liked students who already sounded like adults and distrusted the ones who came in carrying too much life on their backs. At the beginning of the year, before everything happened with my father, he had liked me well enough. I answered questions, turned in assignments early, wrote essays with more care than most 13-year-olds knew how to fake. After the arrest, he changed. Not abruptly. That would have been easier to prove. He changed in ways adults often do when they want to punish without leaving fingerprints. He stopped calling on me, unless he was sure I might fail. He started checking my pockets with his eyes whenever something went missing in class. If someone whispered in the back row, he looked at me first. When I scored high on a state practice test, he held the paper in his hand for a second too long before giving it back, as if intelligence had become suspicious because it came from the wrong last name. Then came the day that stayed with me for 20 years. It was raining that morning. Cold spring rain, with a thin metallic smell. Students came in damp and loud, shaking umbrellas in the hallway and tracking dirty water across the tile. I had stayed up late, finishing a presentation on landmark Supreme Court cases. Brown v. Board. Gideon. Miranda. We were supposed to present in pairs, but my partner had conveniently gotten sick the night before. So I did the whole thing myself. I stood at the front of the class, hands shaking only a little, and made it through 12 slides and 2 follow-up questions without missing a beat. When I finished, the room was quiet in that surprised way classrooms sometimes get when a girl people have already decided to dismiss reminds them she has a mind. Mr. Bennett leaned back against his desk. "Well," he said, "you certainly know a lot about the justice system." A few students laughed. I smiled politely, because I didn't yet hear the angle in his voice. Then he added, "Though in your case, I suppose that may come in handy." The room changed. That is what cruelty does when it is specific enough. It makes the air choose sides. I stood there with my note cards in my hand. "What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged. Too casually. "Nothing. Just that life tends to repeat itself. Children usually follow what they know." There was laughter again. Louder now. Someone behind me said, "Damn." I felt heat rush up my neck. My father made a mistake. I said. I still remember my own voice. Too careful. Too respectful. Still hoping adulthood could be reasoned with. "Mr." Bennett folded his arms. "Armed robbery is not a mistake. Elena, it's a path, and statistically, children raised around criminality tend not to end up in court as lawyers. Usually they end up there another way. The class went quiet, not because they were horrified, because they were enjoying it. Then he smiled. The ugly kind. The one that wants to look educational. If you're lucky. He said, you might still prove me wrong, but if I were a betting man, I'd say prison is more likely. There are moments when humiliation burns so hot it turns cold before it turns into anything else. I picked up my papers, walked back to my seat, sat down, and did not cry. Not there. That mattered to me for years. As if not crying in public meant I had won something. After class, I went into the girls' restroom at the far end of the second-floor hallway, where one stall door never latched and the mirror over the sink always had a crack in the lower left corner. The room smelled like bleach and wet paper towels. I locked myself in the last stall, put both hands over my mouth, and shook so hard my knees hit the metal partition. When I got home, I told no one. Not my Aunt Marisol, who had started checking on me twice a week after my father was sentenced. Not the neighbor downstairs who sometimes sent up soup. And not my father. In the letter I wrote him 3 days later, on ruled paper with blue ink that bled slightly through the page. I didn't tell him because he was already carrying enough shame to drown in. That was another pattern I learned early. Protecting the adults, even from the damage they made possible. But something changed in me after that day. Not outwardly at first. Outwardly, I kept going to school, kept doing the work, kept coming home to a too-quiet apartment and microwaving rice and eggs, and calling my aunt when the gas bill looked frightening. Outwardly, I remained the same girl. Inside, I split in two. One part of me still hurt, still wanted to disappear, still counted how many people stared when I walked down a hallway. The other part began keeping score. Not the shallow kind, the useful kind. I started remembering who looked away and who looked directly at me, which teachers became gentler and which became suspicious, which people treated my father's conviction like a tragedy and which treated it like inherited proof. I started reading not just because I liked books, but because I wanted language sharper than humiliation. I wanted words that could build a life. No one else got to narrate for me. That summer, Aunt Marisol took me in officially. She was my father's younger sister and the only person in the family who had never confused hardness with wisdom. She worked as a hospital billing coordinator, kept a clean apartment full of plants she talked to under her breath, and wore her dark hair in a loose knot that somehow still looked elegant after 10-hour shifts. Her place smelled like cumin, dryer sheets, and the rose hand cream she kept by the sink. The first night I moved in, she didn't ask how I felt. She just handed me fresh sheets and said, "You are safe here. The rest can wait." I loved her for that immediately. She gave me a room barely bigger than a walk-in closet, with one narrow bed, a second-hand desk, and a lamp whose shade leaned slightly to the left. To anyone else it would have looked temporary. To me it looked like permission. I did better in school once I was with her. Not instantly. Trauma is rude that way. It follows you into classrooms and settles into your spine. But there was heat in the apartment. Enough groceries. Les silences. No stack of final notices on the counter. No waiting at the window for a father who now lived behind cinder block and steel doors. At 14, I started staying after school in the library. At 15, I joined debate because one counselor told me I had the face of someone who knows how to make an argument. I wasn't sure whether that was praise or pity, but I took it anyway. At 16, I wrote an essay on judicial discretion that won a statewide civics scholarship worth $1,200 and a framed certificate Aunt Marisol hung in the hallway as if it were a family miracle. Mr. Bennett never congratulated me. He did glance at the announcement poster in the main office when he thought no one was watching. That was enough for me to know. He knew. By my junior year, I had become the kind of student teachers brag about once they decide your story makes them look compassionate. I hated that shift, almost as much as the earlier contempt. Some adults need children to struggle so they can feel wise. Others need them to succeed so they can edit themselves into the victory afterward. Very few simply tell the truth. I got into Northwestern on scholarship, then into law school. The first acceptance letter came on a wind-bitten afternoon in January. I opened it at Aunt Marisol's kitchen table while soup simmered on the stove and the window over the sink fogged at the corners. When I saw the word congratulations, I made a sound I had never heard myself make before, something between a laugh and a sob. Aunt Marisol turned from the stove, read my face in 1 second, and covered her mouth. "Oh, Mia," she whispered. Then she cried. I cried too. Not because getting in erased anything, because for the first time, the future felt larger than what had been said about me in that classroom. I visited my father once more before college. He had aged in the brutal, compressed way incarceration ages men who were already tired before they got there. More gray in his beard, less softness around the eyes. The visiting room smelled the same as ever bleach. Vending sugar. Institutional air. But this time I carried different news into it. I got in. I told him. He stared at me for a second, like the sentence had arrived from underwater. Then he smiled. And in that smile I saw every version of the father he might have remained, if life and weakness and one catastrophic decision had not intersected exactly where they did. "I told you," he said softly. "Judge." That was one of the last good conversations we ever had. He was released 18 months later. But freedom did not restore him. It only returned him to a life already damaged in ways prison rarely repairs. He found work when he could. Missed meetings he shouldn't have missed. Stayed sober for stretches. Then didn't. We loved each other the way broken people often do, earnestly. Inconsistently. With long silences, nobody quite knew how to bridge. He died when I was 27. Overdose. Accidental. According to the report. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was outlining appellate notes in the university law library, with a paper cup of bad coffee cooling beside my elbow. I listened. Thanked the caller twice for some reason I still can't explain. Hung up, then sat very still at the long wooden table while students around me kept typing. Turning pages. Coughing softly into sleeves. Living inside a day that had not split in half. Grief is rarely tidy when the person you lose has also been one of the central injuries of your life. I mourned him. I was angry at him. I missed him. I was relieved that he would never again sound tired on the phone. All of those things were true at once. At his funeral, maybe 30 people came. Aunt Marisol wore black and held my hand so tightly during the service that our rings left marks in our skin. The funeral home smelled like carnations and carpet cleaner. Someone had chosen a hymn he didn't even like. A man from one of his old jobs told me my father had always talked about how smart I was. I believed him. That hurt too. After everyone left, I stood beside the casket with the polished wood shining under low lights and thought about the sentence Miss Bennett had thrown at me when I was 14. Prison is more likely. He had been half right. Prison had been likely. For my father. Maybe even. Statistically. For me, but statistics are not destiny. And cruelty masquerading as prediction is still cruelty. That thought followed me into the years when my life finally began to take the shape I wanted. Law school was brutal, expensive, and full of people who had been trained since childhood to believe they belonged in any room they entered. I was not one of them. I worked in the admissions office, tutored undergraduates, lived in apartments with radiators that screamed all winter, and learned how to make coffee strong enough to feel medicinal. I was often the oldest-looking young person in the room because responsibility had pressed itself into my posture early. I also learned something useful there. Shame has terrible endurance if you leave it unnamed. But once you drag it into the light and study its structure, it becomes less mystical, more procedural, more beatable. I did not become fearless in law school. I became precise. That was better. I clerked after graduation, then became an assistant state's attorney, then moved into judicial work slowly. The way most serious careers actually happen, not with one triumphant moment, but with 1,000 disciplined, unglamorous days nobody outside the profession would ever romanticize. Late filings, hard cases, human messes, defendants younger than they should have been, mothers crying quietly in back rows, public defenders holding the weight of broken systems together with staplers and exhaustion. I learned to speak carefully, because words in a courtroom do not vanish after you say them. They enter records, lives, futures. Maybe that is why the memory of Mr. Bennett never left me, because I built my adult life in the shadow of what one careless, contemptuous sentence can do when spoken by someone with institutional power to a child already drowning in inherited shame. I never looked him up. Not once. I didn't need to. He was not a person in my mind by then. He was a fracture line, a warning, a private oath. Never speak to the powerless, the way the powerful once spoke to you. Years passed. Aunt Marisol retired and moved into a smaller condo with better sunlight and fewer stairs. I bought my first real house at 38, a narrow brick place with a study full of built-in shelves and a magnolia tree in the backyard that dropped enormous waxy leaves every fall. I kept my father's last letter in the top drawer of my desk, tied with a faded blue ribbon I found in Aunt Marisol's sewing tin. I made partner track money for a while, then left private practice for the bench because I had discovered something unsettling and true. I did not want the prestige of law nearly as much as I wanted the discipline of fairness. Before Tituo, I had been on the county bench long enough that the robe felt less like costume and more like responsibility. The courthouse was old limestone outside, fluorescent inside, with echoing corridors and elevators that took too long. Every morning I arrived before most of the building woke up, unlocked my chambers, set my bag on the side table, and spent 10 quiet minutes reviewing the docket while the radiator ticked awake and the sky changed color through the window overlooking the parking structure. On the morning that changed everything, rain had passed overnight and left the city washed dull and silver. My clerk, Naomi, handed me the calendar just after 8 with a clipped summary of the more sensitive matters on the afternoon docket. One of them was a fraud-related preliminary hearing involving misuse of school funds and falsified reimbursement claims filed through a district program. I read the brief summary once. Then again. Former teacher, Daniel Bennett, 62. My eyes stopped on the name, but my mind did not catch up immediately. Bennett is not a rare name. For half a second, it was only a word on paper. Then the age attached itself. Then the school district. And something inside me went perfectly still. Naomi must have noticed something because she asked, "Judge?" I looked up. Nothing. I said, "Please have that file brought in full." She nodded and left. I sat alone in chambers, with the file open in front of me, and a dull pressure building behind my ribs. The rain-dark window reflected my own face back at me faintly over the paperwork. Older now. Composed. Controlled. A face no one would have predicted in that 8th grade classroom, except maybe my father, who had once said judge as if it were prophecy instead of affection. The file was enough to confirm the possibility, but not enough to settle it. Employment history matched. District names aligned. Dates fit. There was even a scanned personnel form with a middle initial I remembered from old syllabi. Daniel Bennett. I closed the file, then opened it again. Not because I doubted what I was seeing, because some part of my body still thought the past should require more ceremony before it walks into your day wearing a defendant's name. I considered recusal. Of course I did. Any serious judge would. But the matter before me was limited. Preliminary. Procedural. I had no current personal relationship with the defendant. No outside contact. No financial interest. No extrajudicial knowledge relevant to the allegations beyond old personal history that had nothing to do with the present charges. Ethically, it was not automatic. Emotionally, it was a storm. I sat with that for a long minute. Then another. In the end, I made the decision that felt both hardest and most honest. I would remain on the case through the hearing, unless counsel raised a basis requiring otherwise. Not because I wanted revenge, because I trusted myself not to use power the way he once had. That distinction mattered more than anything. Still, as the morning passed, I found myself moving through routine with a strange double vision, signing orders, hearing motions, speaking calmly from the bench, while a 14-year-old version of me sat cross-legged somewhere deep in memory, with note cards in her hand and humiliation in her throat. At noon, I stood alone in chambers eating half a turkey sandwich. I could barely taste and stared at the framed oath on the wall near the door. Faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon me. Impartially. That word can sound bloodless until it costs you something. Atunu 477 p.m. I walked into courtroom 4B. The benches creaked as people settled. The clerk arranged files. The bailiff called the room to order. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A mother in the second row tried to quiet a restless toddler with crackers in a plastic cup. Someone near the back smelled faintly of rain and cigarettes. The whole room felt ordinary in the way life often does right before it reaches back for you. I took the bench. We moved through 2 routine matters. Then the bailiff called the next case. The defense attorney rose first. Then the defendant. And when he stepped fully into view, lifting his eyes toward me, with that same old posture made brittle by fear and habit, I knew. It was him. Daniel Bennett. Older. Thinner. Face drawn downward by age and consequences. But him, the man who had looked at a child and mistaken contempt for insight, the man who told me I would probably end up in prison like my father. And now he was standing in my courtroom, waiting for me to speak. For one suspended second, Daniel Bennett did not recognize me. Why would he? Men like him rarely remember the children they wounded, unless those children stay broken in a way that flatters the original cruelty. To him, I was probably just another judge in another courtroom on another bad day, in a life that had apparently narrowed far more than he once imagined possible. But I recognized him instantly. Not just the face. The posture, the habit of authority still clinging to him even now, like an old cologne that no longer suited the body wearing it. He stood at the defense table in a wrinkled charcoal suit that had been pressed too early and worn too long. His hair, once clipped and exact, had thinned into brittle gray at the temples. His mouth had collapsed inward. In that particular way, bitterness seems to carve into people over time. Beside him, his attorney was already flipping through a legal pad, steady and professional, unaware that the room had just shifted in a way no file could explain. I kept my expression neutral. That is one of the first disciplines the bench teaches you. You do not perform shock. You do not perform recognition. You do not let the room feel what you feel until you have decided whether what you feel is relevant to justice. The clerk read the case. Misuse of district discretionary funds. Falsified reimbursement submissions. Improper redirection of school activity money through fabricated educational expenses over a period of nearly 18 months. The allegations were not violent, not dramatic in the cinematic way people expect wrongdoing to be, but they were ugly in a quieter way. Public school money, student program funds, small amounts taken repeatedly because the thief assumed no one would look closely enough to care. I listened, asked counsel whether either side intended to raise preliminary motions. Neither did. Mr. Bennett kept his attention fixed on the front rail rather than my face. His lawyer spoke first, outlining procedural concerns and requesting modified reporting conditions, pending review of a fuller evidentiary packet. The prosecutor answered. I took notes. My pen moved steadily over the margin of the docket sheet, while the 14-year-old version of me stood somewhere deep in memory, with note cards in her trembling hand. Then, at last, Daniel Bennett looked up properly. Our eyes met, and I watched recognition arrive. It did not happen all at once. First confusion, then concentration, then a tiny recoil in the muscles around his mouth. I had seen that exact progression on witnesses before. The moment a person realizes the room they thought they understood has changed shape around them. He knew me. Not by name yet. Perhaps. But by memory. The old classroom had opened in his mind just as surely as it had in mine. Still, procedure moved forward. Because that is the thing about real power. It does not need to rush. Counsel, I said, my voice even. I have reviewed the charging documents and the preliminary submissions from both sides. We will address release conditions first. The attorney beside him straightened. The prosecutor nodded. Mr. Bennett continued staring at me with that thin, unsettled look of someone trying to decide whether the past has truly entered the room or whether fear is making patterns out of coincidence. I set conditions. Standard reporting. No direct or indirect contact with district personnel involved in the audit beyond counsel. No access to school financial systems. Passport surrender within 48 hours. The defense requested leniency, citing age, health, community roots, and lack of prior criminal history. The prosecutor countered that the alleged conduct involved repeated acts of deception within a public trust position and warranted closer oversight. I asked 3 questions, then 4. By the third, Mr. Bennett had stopped pretending not to know me. I could feel it. Not in anything, he said. He said nothing. In the way fear changes stillness. When the preliminary matters concluded, I set the next hearing date and gave routine scheduling instructions. That should have been the end of it. A short hearing. A controlled day. A closed circle left unopened. But before the bailiff could move the room forward, defense counsel rose again. "Your Honor," he said carefully. "My client requests a brief moment for clarification on a possible prior connection that may bear on comfort with the proceedings." There it was. Not ethics. Not yet. Comfort. As if discomfort were the injury. I folded my hands. "You may state the nature of the concern." The attorney glanced at Bennett, who looked like a man swallowing broken glass. "My client believes he may have known Your Honor many years ago in an educational setting." I let a beat pass. That is not, by itself, grounds for recusal. No, Your Honor, of course. I looked at Bennett directly for the first time since the recognition had settled fully between us. "Mr. Bennett," I said, "do you believe I have any personal knowledge relevant to the allegations in this case beyond what is before the court?" His lips parted. Closed. Opened again. "No," he said at last. The voice was older. Raspier. But it was the same voice. The one that used to lace contempt through ordinary sentences and call it guidance. "Do you believe," I continued, "that I am unable to rule fairly on the matters presently before the court?" His attorney shifted slightly, perhaps wondering what history he had just stepped into. "Mr. Bennett looked at me, and for a second, I saw it clearly. He wanted me to rescue him from the answer. He wanted the old arrangement. The powerful adult sets the terms. The younger person softens reality to protect the stronger one from embarrassment. Only now the positions had changed. And that frightened him. "No," he said finally. The word barely made it into the room. "Very well," I said. "The matter remains set as ordered." I struck the gavel once. Clean. Controlled. And the hearing ended. But the story did not, because once court recessed, I stood, turned, and walked through the side door into chambers, with my pulse suddenly thudding so hard it felt like something trying to get out of me. I closed the door behind me, set both palms on the edge of my desk, and stared at the shelves opposite the window until the room stopped tilting. Naomi waited 2 respectful seconds before speaking. "Judge?" I let out a slow breath. "Yes." She stepped closer. "Dogel Fräulein Hent. Do you want me to reassign the afternoon review?" "No." She hesitated. Then, very gently, "Do you know him?" I looked at her. Naomi was one of those people who had learned the exact right amount of restraint. She never pushed when silence mattered. Never hovered when competence would do. Late 30s. Smart eyes. 2 children. Divorce filed but not yet final. The kind of woman who had probably spent years learning how to survive rooms that asked her to do so elegantly. "Yes?" I said. She nodded once. "That enough for recusal?" "No." I said, "Not on the substance before us." Again, she did not pry. That was one reason I trusted her. She just placed the next set of papers on my desk and said, "I'll clear 10 minutes before your next matter." When she left, I sat down slowly and looked at my own reflection in the dark glass of the window. What I felt was not revenge. That surprised me. All those years, if I allowed myself to imagine that man again, I imagined rage, some blazing internal satisfaction, some perfect emotional symmetry. Instead, what I felt was older than anger. More exact. Grief. Maybe. Not for him. For the child version of me who had believed adults when they told her what she was. A soft knock came 15 minutes later. Naomi opened the door halfway. Judge? Defense counsel for Bennett is asking whether you'd permit a brief off-record conversation in chambers before they leave the building. I stared at her. With or without his client? With his client? There were at least 3 reasons to say no. 2 ethical cautions. 1 emotional, but I also knew exactly what kind of conversation this was likely to be. Not about the case, about recognition, about discomfort, about a man who had once spoken carelessly into a child's future and now found himself standing in front of what that child had become. I considered, then made the only decision that felt honest and safe. Open door, I said, Naomi present. She nodded. A minute later, Bennett entered my chambers with his attorney. The room always seemed smaller when frightened people came into it. The bookshelves too close, the diplomas too visible, the framed oath on the wall too final. His attorney did most of the initial talking. My client wished to acknowledge, he began, that there appears to be a long-ago acquaintance and that, if it creates discomfort, it does, I said. He stopped. Bennett went still. I continued. It creates discomfort, but discomfort is not the legal standard. The attorney swallowed. Understood, Your Honor. I looked at Bennett. He looked older here than he had in court, less defended. The performance had nowhere to stand. You wanted to say something? I said. He glanced at his lawyer, then at Naomi, then back at me. Yes. His voice had gone quieter. I remember you. I waited. He did too, as if hoping that alone might do some work for him. When I said nothing, he continued, I didn't realize, not until I looked up. No. I said, you didn't. His attorney shifted again, sensing he was no longer managing the conversation in any meaningful way. Bennett wet his lips. I was hard on students sometimes. That was how he chose to describe it. Hard. A small, cowardly word. I felt something inside me harden. But my face stayed still. You told a 14-year-old girl she would probably end up in prison like her father. He closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Naomi remained silent near the file cabinet. The attorney said nothing. Good. Let the truth stand without padding. Bennett opened his eyes again. I shouldn't have said it. No. I said, you shouldn't have thought it. That landed. He looked down. And for the first time since he entered chambers, I saw not just fear but collapse. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just the exhausting realization that he no longer had language strong enough to rearrange reality in his favor. I was wrong, he said. I believed that part. Not because he had become noble. Because age and exposure had finally stripped him down to something less polished than denial. Still, wrong was not the whole truth. You were an authority. I said, that made it worse. He nodded. I know. Do you? He looked at me. And to his credit, he didn't try to flee the question. I think I do now. he said. The answer was imperfect. Maybe that made it more honest. I leaned back slightly in my chair. What exactly do you want from this conversation? Mr. Bennett. He took too long to answer. That told me more than his words would. Finally, he said, I wanted to say I'm sorry. There it was. The apology. The thing people imagine changes everything. But apologies are strange objects. Their value depends less on wording than on what they arrive to preserve. Some apologies protect the wounded. Others protect the speaker from fully seeing himself. I studied him carefully. His suit cuffs were frayed. There was a stain near one button he had probably missed in bad light. His hands, once always meticulously clean in the classroom, now trembled faintly against the back of the chair in front of him. He looked less like the monster memory sometimes makes of people, and more like something almost harder to deal with. A man, ordinary enough to do lasting damage. I accept that you're saying it now, I said. His eyes flicked upward. Then I continued. But I am not here to relieve you of what it meant. The room went still again. That, I think, it was the first truly just sentence I gave him. Because mercy is not the same thing as making consequences emotionally convenient for the person who caused them. Bennett's shoulders lowered a fraction. His attorney finally stepped in. We appreciate the court's time. I nodded. Then, because I had not spent 20 years building a life around restraint just to waste the moment on cruelty, I said the thing that had become clear to me the second I saw him standing below the bench. The outcome of your case will rest on law, not memory. You will receive the same fairness here as anyone else, more than some children receive from adults. He flinched. Good. Not because pain was satisfying, because truth without evasion was the only thing left worth giving him. The attorney thanked me again, thinly this time, and guided him toward the door. Just before he stepped out, Bennett turned back. Your father? He said, then stopped. I waited. I was wrong about you. I held his gaze. Yes. I said, you were... Then they left. When the door closed, Naomi remained silent for a few seconds. Then she asked, You okay? I let out a breath that felt a decade old. No. I said, but I'm steady. She nodded. That counts. It did. The next hearing came 3 weeks later. By then, the audit trail had deepened. More records, more statements, more clarity. The district's internal review suggested Bennett had been submitting altered educational reimbursement claims tied to student civic travel, debate materials, and historical programming expenses. Small amounts at first, then larger. Always plausible. Always just under the threshold that might trigger real scrutiny. It was almost sad in its banality. A man who once stood at the front of a classroom speaking about civic duty had apparently spent the last years of his career quietly siphoning money from programs meant for the same age group he once presumed to predict into failure. The irony was too neat for fiction. Real life, unfortunately, specializes in that kind of ugliness. He did not grandstand in later hearings. Did not try to challenge my presence again. His attorney eventually negotiated a plea framework with the state, guilty to reduced felony misconduct and restitution conditions in exchange for suspended incarceration and supervised community penalties tied to age, medical considerations, and lack of prior record. Some people would call that lenient. Some would call it merciful. What I called it was lawful. And that mattered more than anything I felt privately. The day of final disposition. The courtroom was fuller than before. Not packed, but fuller. A few district employees. One local reporter. 2 older women I guessed were relatives. A former colleague, perhaps. The benches creaked under shifting weight. Rain tapped against the high windows. The air held that familiar courthouse blend of paper, wool coats, and tired coffee. When Bennett stood for allocution, he looked smaller than he had at the first hearing. That can happen when certainty drains out of a person. He cleared his throat. Read from a page. Then put it down halfway through and spoke without it. He admitted wrongdoing. Not elegantly. Not fully. But enough? He said he had told himself for years that the district owed him more than it gave him, that he had justified each false claim as temporary. That temporary became routine. Routine became entitlement. Entitlement became self-deception. Then, after a visible pause, he added something not required by law. I spent much of my life believing I was good at knowing what kind of people others would become. He said, I was wrong more than once in ways that mattered. The room was quiet. I did not rescue him from the ambiguity. If he meant me, he meant me. If he meant himself too, better. When it was my turn to speak, I kept to the law. The breach of trust, the public nature of the funds, the duty educators owe to the institutions and students they serve, the seriousness of repeated dishonesty, the mitigating factors also present. A. Restitution. Acceptance. No unnecessary theater. No private history turned into public performance. That was important to me. Because justice is not stronger when it imitates humiliation. It is stronger when it refuses to. I imposed sentence. Restitution. Community supervision. Permanent prohibition from holding fiduciary responsibility in district educational programs. Professional reporting requirements. No incarceration. Some in the room seemed surprised. Maybe they expected harshness once they sensed there was history. Maybe they mistook vengeance for strength. I didn't. Because the child in me had wanted someone powerful to prove they could see clearly without being cruel. So that is what I gave the man who had failed to do it for me. When I finished, I looked directly at him. Mr. Bennett, the court's decision is based on the conduct before it and the law governing it. You are responsible for what you chose. Nothing more, nothing less. He nodded once. Then, very quietly, understood. That was the final word between us in court. No dramatic collapse. No tears. No cinematic apology in front of an audience. Just a record. A sentence? A truth placed where it belonged. Afterward, in chambers, I removed my robe more slowly than usual and hung it over the back of the inner door. My shoulders hurt. My head hurt. The rain outside had turned steady, making the courthouse windows look smoked over and distant. Naomi brought me tea without asking, left it on the side table, and closed the door behind her. I sat alone for a long time. People think closure feels like a lock turning. It doesn't. Usually it feels like exhaustion without panic. Like reaching the end of a sentence someone else started years ago and finally placing your own period at the end. That evening, I drove to Aunt Marisol's condo. She was 70 now. Silver at the temples. Still elegant in the unforced way of women who never needed performance to hold a room. Her place smelled like garlic. Basil. And the lavender sachets she tucked into linen drawers. Rainwater beaded on the balcony railing outside her kitchen. She took one look at my face and said, "Something happened." I sat at her small round table, wrapped both hands around the mug she placed in front of me, and told her everything. Not quickly, not dramatically, just carefully, the way one handles glass. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she asked, "And how do you feel?" I looked at the steam rising from the tea. Not the way I thought I would. She smiled a little. "That usually means it's real." I laughed softly. Then, after a moment, I said, "He apologized." She lifted one shoulder. And? And I didn't need it. That answer surprised me, even as I said it. Because it was true. At 14, maybe I would have needed it like oxygen. At 20, like vindication. At 30, like proof I had not invented the harm. But now it was simply information. Useful. Perhaps. Not healing. The healing had come somewhere else. In work. In time. In the people who named me correctly. In the choices I made after other people tried to define me too early. Aunt Marisol reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm glad," she said. "For what? That you gotta be the adult in the room he never was?" I carried that sentence home with me. Weeks passed. Then months. The story might have ended there if life were tidy. But family rarely allows neat endings. My mother called in late November. We did not speak often. Our relationship had improved with distance and careful limits. But it still lived in that delicate space where affection and unfinished hurt sit at opposite ends of the same table, pretending not to notice each other. She asked how I was. I told her I was tired. Then, after a pause, I mentioned the case. Not all of it. Just enough. There was silence on the line. Then she said, "You must have wanted to destroy him." I stood in my kitchen looking out at bare branches moving against a pale evening sky. "No," I said, "I wanted him to matter less." That was the truest thing I could have said. Revenge is often imagined as fire. But real freedom is colder. Cleaner. It is the moment someone who shaped your pain no longer gets to shape your decisions. My mother was quiet for a few seconds. Then she asked, "Did he know who you were?" "Yes." And he had to stand there and understand it? She exhaled softly. Maybe she heard more in that than I said. Maybe not. Either way, we moved on. That, too, was a kind of healing. Not every conversation has to become a confession booth to become less broken than it once was. Near Christmas, I visited my father's grave. I don't go often. Not because I don't care, because grief for him has always been complicated enough that I prefer to meet it deliberately. The cemetery was damp and nearly empty. The grass flattened in places by recent frost. The air smelled like cold earth and wet stone. I stood in my dark coat with gloved hands in my pockets and looked down at his name carved into granite. For a while, I said nothing. Then I laughed once under my breath, not out of disrespect, because I could suddenly hear him. Judge. That old nickname. That impossible tenderness. You were wrong about a lot, I said quietly to the stone. But not that. The wind moved through the bare trees. A car passed somewhere beyond the gates. And I stood there thinking about how close shame had come to taking my life before I had even really started living it. Not by killing me, by naming me too early, by convincing me I was already a conclusion instead of a person. That is the real violence of being judged by inheritance. It steals time. It makes you spend years arguing with a verdict no court ever formally entered. Mr. Bennett had done that. My father had made it easier for him. The world had helped, and still, somehow, I had built a life beyond it. Not because I was chosen, because I kept choosing. There is a difference. If you are listening to this and you grew up under someone else's shadow, hear me carefully. Blood is not prophecy. Other people's fear is not foresight. And when someone in authority speaks to your worst possibility as if it is your destiny, they are not revealing the future. They are revealing themselves. The greatest thing that happened in that courtroom was not that an old teacher had to look up and see what I became. It was that I looked down at him and felt no need to become cruel in return. That was the real victory. Not power. Not status. Not the robe. Disciplina. Freedom. The refusal to let pain dictate character. 20 years earlier, he had looked at me and seen a prison statistic. A damaged girl. A father's failure waiting to repeat itself. What he could not imagine was this: that one day I would sit above him in a room built around judgment and choose fairness anyway. That is what vindication looked like for me. Not making him small. Just refusing to be. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. And if you have ever had to outgrow a label someone else put on your life too early, leave the word verdict in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is return a sentence to the person who never had the right to write it for you.